In January 1944, tens of thousands of German soldiers sat behind barbed wire across Europe, staring at a future they believed they already understood. They believed capture meant punishment. They believed Britain was a place of hunger, humiliation, and deliberate cruelty. They believed this not because they had seen it, but because they had been prepared for it. For years, they had been told what awaited them if they fell into British hands. They rehearsed it in their minds long before it happened. And so, when the moment of capture finally arrived, what shocked them most was not what Britain did to them. It was how wrong they had been about everything they thought they knew. The expectation of punishment did not begin on the battlefield. It began years earlier, inside classrooms, barracks, training fields, and radio broadcasts. From the early 1930s onward, German soldiers were taught that the outside world was hostile, decadent, and fundamentally dishonest. Britain, in particular, was portrayed as a nation that spoke of fairness while practicing exploitation, a nation that smiled while starving its enemies, a nation that obeyed rules only when convenient. This message was consistent. It was repeated quietly and constantly. It did not rely on rage. It relied on certainty. British captivity, German soldiers were told, would not be marked by beatings or chaos. It would be worse. It would be cold, calculated, and degrading. Food would be scarce. Medical care would be delayed. Discipline would be enforced through neglect rather than violence. Guards would not shout, they would ignore. They would let prisoners weaken slowly, stripped of dignity and purpose. This belief shaped how German soldiers prepared themselves psychologically for war. Capture was not simply a loss of freedom, it was a moral defeat. To surrender was to place oneself at the mercy of an enemy described as hypocritical and vindictive. Many soldiers believed that Britain would make examples of them, that officers would be humiliated, that enlisted men would be used as labor until exhaustion, that kindness, if it appeared at all, would be a trap. These ideas were reinforced by selective stories. Tales of harsh camps from the First World War were retold, stripped of context and exaggerated. Newspaper articles described British hunger at home, suggesting prisoners would fare worse. Radio broadcasts framed Britain as a nation barely holding together, resentful and eager to take revenge on captured Germans. By the time the war reached its later stages, this mental image was deeply rooted. It was not questioned. It did not need to be. It explained everything. For soldiers fighting in North Africa, Italy, or Western Europe, Britain was not an abstract concept. It was a destination they feared. Rumors circulated through units about camps in cold countryside, about endless rules, about silent guards who watched without speaking. Some believed prisoners would be shipped overseas and forgotten. Others believed Britain would deliberately break them psychologically, turning them into warnings for those still fighting. Even officers, trained to analyze information critically, accepted these assumptions. Many prepared themselves for captivity as one prepares for illness. They rehearsed endurance. They planned how to conserve strength. They told themselves not to expect mercy. As Allied pressure increased in 1943 and early 1944, surrender became more common, even if reluctantly. German soldiers found themselves surrounded, outgunned, or cut off. In those moments, the fear of capture was not abstract. It was immediate. Hands raised slowly, weapons placed on the ground, eyes scanning faces of enemy soldiers for signs of what would come next. Those captured by British units often noticed something unexpected immediately, though they did not yet understand its significance. There was no shouting, no visible anger. Orders were given calmly. Procedures were followed precisely. Prisoners were searched, counted, and moved. It felt efficient, impersonal. Many interpreted this as the first stage of punishment. The journey into captivity reinforced their expectations. Transport was orderly. Guards did not strike them, but neither did they speak much. Food was simple but regular. Water was provided. Medical attention was given when necessary without commentary. To German prisoners, this felt unsettling. It did not match the cruelty they expected, but it also did not match kindness. It felt deliberate, controlled, and distant. For some, this confirmed their fears. This was British discipline at work. The real hardship, they assumed, would come later. By late 1943, Britain was receiving increasing numbers of German prisoners. Some arrived directly from battlefields in France and Italy. Others were transferred from North Africa. They were processed through reception centers, documented carefully, and assigned identification numbers. Everything was recorded. Nothing appeared random. To the prisoners, this meticulous order suggested something ominous. A system this precise, they believed, must exist to control and punish effectively. The absence of visible cruelty only deepened their suspicion. They had been taught that British methods were subtle, that humiliation would replace violence, that routine would replace brutality. As transport ships crossed the channel, prisoners stood on deck or sat below, watching the coastline approach. Britain, the enemy they had heard about for years, slowly came into view. Green fields, small towns, calm harbors. None of it resembled the image they had been given. This, too, unsettled them. They disembarked under guard, expecting at any moment for the tone to change, for discipline to tighten, for rations to shrink, for rules to multiply, for punishment to begin. Instead, they were marched through quiet streets, often watched by civilians who did not shout or spit, but simply observed. Some turned away, some looked curious, some appeared indifferent. Indifference was not expected. German propaganda had portrayed British civilians as vengeful, eager to humiliate captured soldiers. The lack of reaction felt unnatural. Prisoners tried to interpret it. Was this contempt? Was it restraint? Or was it simply normal life continuing? The caps themselves varied in size and structure, but they shared common features: barbed wire, Gower towers, wooden huts, or repurposed buildings. Everything was functional, clean, maintained. There was no sense of chaos. Upon arrival, prisoners were assigned bunks. They were given blankets. They were informed of camp rules. The rules were strict but clear. Roll calls at set times, work assignments explained, medical inspections scheduled. For many German prisoners, this was the moment when expectation began to strain against reality, though it did not yet break. They had expected punishment. What they encountered instead was structure. They had expected hostility. What they encountered was distance. They had expected neglect. What they encountered was routine care. This contradiction created psychological tension. It was not comforting, it was confusing. Prisoners scrutinized every detail: the quality of bread, the cleanliness of utensils, the tone of guards' voices, the consistency of meals. Everything was analyzed for signs of hidden intent. Surely, they believed, this was temporary. Surely, the real treatment would emerge once the British no longer needed to maintain appearances. They spoke quietly among themselves, reinforcing familiar explanations. Britain needed to look humane for propaganda purposes. International observers might be watching. The Geneva Convention required certain standards. Once attention faded, conditions would worsen. This reasoning allowed their beliefs to remain intact. Yet small details continued to intrude. Medical staff treated wounds thoroughly. Doctors explained procedures. Sick prisoners were isolated to prevent spread of illness. Packages from the Red Cross arrived and were distributed according to regulation. None of this aligned with the image of calculated neglect they had been taught. Still, belief is resilient. It bends before it breaks. Many prisoners noticed that guards followed rules as strictly as the prisoners did. Punishments, when they occurred, were formal and proportionate. Infractions were recorded. Appeals were possible. This predictability was unfamiliar. German military discipline had been rigid, but also arbitrary, shaped by authority rather than procedure. In Britain, authority seemed constrained by process. This observation unsettled prisoners deeply, though few articulated it openly. A system that limited its own power was difficult to understand, especially after years under a regime that celebrated absolute control. At night, lying on bunks, prisoners replayed the day in their minds. They searched for evidence that punishment was coming. They waited for hunger to sharpen, for guards to turn cruel, for privileges to be withdrawn. But days passed, then weeks. Rations remained steady. Work assignments were often agricultural or maintenance-related, not punitive labor. Some prisoners worked on farms, repairing fences or harvesting crops under supervision. They returned to camp in the evening, tired but intact. This, too, did not fit expectations. They had believed they would be used until exhaustion, deliberately weakened. Instead, work hours were regulated, rest periods enforced, injuries treated, complaints recorded. None of this erased fear. It redirected it inward. If Britain was not punishing them as expected, then what was the purpose of this treatment? Was it indifference? Was it manipulation? Was it meant to confuse and demoralize them more effectively than cruelty ever could? German soldiers had been taught to respect strength and fear brutality. Calm restraint felt like something else entirely. As winter turned toward spring in 1944, more prisoners arrived. Stories circulated within camps. Some confirmed familiar fears. Others contradicted them. Arguments broke out quietly over interpretation. Older soldiers insisted this was all temporary. Younger ones, less certain, simply observed. What united them was anticipation, a sense that the real test had not yet begun. They were waiting for punishment. They did not yet realize that the absence of punishment was itself the beginning of something far more destabilizing. By the time the camp settled into routine and the initial shock of arrival faded, German prisoners stood at the edge of a realization they were not ready to face. The Britain they had expected to encounter had not appeared, not yet, perhaps not at all. But belief does not collapse instantly. It resists. It seeks explanations that preserve itself. And so, as January gave way to February 1944, German prisoners in Britain continued to wait. They waited for cruelty. They waited for hunger. They waited for humiliation. They waited for Britain to become the place they had been told it was. That moment did not come, and in its absence, something far more unsettling began to take shape. In February 1944, as weeks of captivity turned into months, German prisoners in Britain began to sense that waiting itself had become the problem. The punishment they had prepared for did not arrive. Instead, time settled into a steady rhythm, and with it came a growing, quiet unease. Nothing dramatic happened. Nothing violent occurred. And yet, something fundamental was beginning to shift, not in their surroundings, but inside their certainty. The first shock was not kindness, it was normality. Days in British camps followed a predictable structure. Roll call in the morning, breakfast served at the same hour, work assignments posted clearly, lunch distributed without delay, evenings quiet, lights out enforced consistently. This order was not improvised, it was maintained carefully, day after day, regardless of weather, mood, or events at the front. German prisoners had expected unpredictability. They had prepared themselves for arbitrary treatment, for sudden changes designed to weaken morale. Instead, they encountered a system that behaved the same way every day. The reliability itself felt disorienting. Food became an early point of internal conflict. It was not abundant, it was not luxurious, but it was sufficient. Bread arrived daily. Soup was warm. Portions were measured and consistent. There were no sudden shortages meant to remind prisoners of their dependence. Hunger existed, but it was the background hunger of wartime Britain, not a weapon directed at them. Some prisoners saved scraps, convinced rations would soon shrink. Others ate cautiously, expecting punishment for finishing too quickly. Weeks passed. Nothing changed. This constancy forced prisoners to confront a troubling possibility. If the British wanted to punish them through deprivation, why was the deprivation so restrained? Medical care deepened this confusion. Sick prisoners were not ignored. They were examined, isolated when necessary, treated according to protocols that appeared identical to those used for British civilians. Doctors did not rush. They did not lecture. They explained procedures, sometimes through interpreters. For men who had been told that British mercy was a lie, this attention felt almost threatening. It challenged the framework through which they interpreted enemy behavior. Silence played an unexpected role. Guards rarely spoke unless necessary. Orders were given clearly, without insult or emphasis. There was no need to raise voices. Authority did not need to announce itself repeatedly. German prisoners had been taught to associate silence with suppressed hostility. They searched for hidden contempt in the guards' restraint. They studied facial expressions. They listened for tone. Most found nothing. Work assignments introduced another layer of shock. Many prisoners were sent outside camp under guard to farms or maintenance sites. They repaired roads, harvested crops, cleared debris. The work was real and necessary, not symbolic punishment. Farmers spoke to guards. Guards spoke to prisoners. Sometimes words were exchanged plainly, even casually. This unsettled prisoners more than harsh labor would have. Casual interaction suggested a lack of hatred. British civilians did not behave as expected either. Prisoners anticipated anger, insults, or deliberate humiliation. Instead, they encountered indifference mixed with guarded curiosity. Civilians watched prisoners pass through villages, then returned to their routines. Some nodded, some avoided eye contact, few reacted at all. This absence of emotional response created an uncomfortable mirror. German prisoners had been told they would be hated. Instead, they were largely ignored. The shock was cumulative. No single moment shattered belief. It eroded it gradually. At night, conversations in huts grew quieter and more analytical. Prisoners debated explanations. Some insisted Britain was staging a performance for international scrutiny. Others argued that the real punishment would come later, once labor demands increased or the war situation worsened. Yet the calendar continued to move forward without confirming these theories. Letters from home arrived intermittently, censored, delayed, but delivered. Prisoners read about bombings, shortages, and loss. Britain, they learned, was also under strain. Civilians were rationed, cities damaged, lives disrupted. And yet, even under pressure, the camps maintained their standards. This fact disturbed prisoners more than open cruelty would have. It suggested that restraint was not weakness, it was a choice. Guards enforced rules strictly but predictably. Punishments existed, extra duties, temporary confinement, loss of privileges, but these penalties were defined in advance. They followed infractions logically. There was no sense of personal vengeance. German military culture had emphasized obedience to authority as an expression of strength. In Britain, authority seemed impersonal, almost administrative. Rules mattered more than rank or emotion. This distinction gnawed at prisoners' assumptions. The erosion of certainty accelerated through small human details. A guard returning a dropped item rather than confiscating it. A supervisor ensuring a wounded prisoner was relieved from work. A medical orderly asking about symptoms instead of dismissing them. None of these acts were dramatic. They did not feel like mercy. They felt routine. Routine kindness, however, was far more destabilizing than exceptional cruelty. Some prisoners reacted defensively. They withdrew. They avoided interaction. They interpreted every gesture as manipulation. Others began to observe more openly, though they rarely spoke of it aloud. Admitting confusion felt dangerous. It suggested weakness. German military culture had trained prisoners to see the world in moral absolutes. Enemy nations were cruel by nature. Allies were righteous. This clarity provided psychological stability during war. Britain's behavior disrupted that clarity without offering a replacement. As weeks passed, prisoners noticed something else. British guards adhered to the same rules regardless of nationality. Italian prisoners received similar treatment. So did others. There was no hierarchy of hatred. This universality made propaganda explanations harder to sustain. If Britain was merely pretending, the performance was remarkably consistent. The shock deepened during interactions with British officers. These officers did not lecture prisoners about ideology. They did not demand gratitude. They did not attempt overt re-education. They focused on administration, logistics, and order. The absence of ideological confrontation was unexpected. German prisoners had been taught that Britain would attempt to humiliate them morally, to force confessions or renunciations. Instead, Britain seemed uninterested in their beliefs. This indifference toward ideology was perhaps the most unsettling element of all. Belief systems survive conflict by framing opposition as hostile and intrusive. Britain did neither. It simply managed captivity as a bureaucratic responsibility. Slowly, prisoners began to realize that their mental preparation had been misdirected. They had armored themselves against cruelty that never arrived. Meanwhile, they were unprotected against something else entirely. They were unprepared for fairness. Fairness did not feel benevolent. It felt destabilizing. It removed the moral clarity that justified suffering. If Britain was not behaving as expected, then perhaps the narrative that defined the enemy was flawed. This realization did not bring relief. It brought anxiety. Some prisoners responded by clinging more tightly to familiar beliefs. They emphasized British air raids. They recalled propaganda stories. They warned others not to be deceived. But repetition could not restore certainty once doubt had taken root. The environment itself reinforced doubt. Camps were clean, not because of generosity, but because disease threatened efficiency. Food was adequate, not because of compassion, but because regulations demanded it. Work was structured not to punish, but to maintain productivity. Yet motives mattered less than outcomes. The outcome contradicted expectation. By March 1944, many prisoners had experienced their first unguarded moments of reflection, standing in fields, watching British countryside change with the seasons, observing civilians repairing homes damaged by bombing. Life continued, not triumphantly, not cruelly, simply persistently. This continuity of ordinary life was perhaps the greatest shock. German propaganda had portrayed Britain as fragile, decadent, on the verge of collapse. Instead, prisoners saw resilience expressed through routine. The erosion of belief accelerated quietly. It did not announce itself. It manifested as questions that could not be fully answered. If Britain was so cruel, why was cruelty unnecessary? If British values were empty, why were they practiced consistently under strain? If this was all deception, why maintain it when no one was watching? These questions lingered without resolution. Some prisoners began to feel something they did not expect and did not welcome. Not gratitude, not admiration, but uncertainty about their own certainty. This psychological tension was exhausting. It demanded constant reinterpretation of experience. Every polite interaction required explanation. Every fair outcome required justification. Belief systems are efficient. They reduce complexity. Britain's behavior reintroduced complexity where none had existed. By late March 1944, the first clear realization began to surface among some prisoners, though it was rarely spoken directly. The realization was not that Britain was kind. It was that Britain was not behaving according to the script they had been given. This distinction mattered. They were not being punished as enemies. They were being managed as captives. This shift undermined more than fear. It undermined purpose. If captivity was not meant to degrade them, then what did surrender signify? If the enemy was not monstrous, then what justified total war? These questions pressed inward, destabilizing identities built on certainty. The shock was not explosive, it was corrosive. As spring approached and camps settled into an unremarkable rhythm, German prisoners in Britain found themselves facing a truth they had not prepared for. The danger was no longer physical, it was cognitive. Something was fundamentally wrong with what they had been told. They could feel it. They could not yet name it, but once felt, it could not be ignored. And from that moment forward, belief no longer stood intact. It began, slowly and inevitably, to collapse. In April 1944, as the routines of captivity continued without interruption, German prisoners in Britain reached a quiet threshold. The shock of contradiction had done its work. What followed was not a sudden awakening, but a gradual internal collapse, slow enough that many did not recognize it while it was happening. Beliefs that had once felt immovable began to loosen, not because they were attacked, but because they were no longer supported by experience. The collapse did not begin with ideology. It began with trust in one's own preparation. German soldiers had been trained to believe that they understood the enemy. That understanding had given meaning to sacrifice, discipline, and obedience. Now, confronted with a reality that refused to match expectation, they faced a destabilizing realization. Their mental armor had been designed for a threat that did not exist. This realization was deeply unsettling. As spring progressed, prisoners stopped waiting for punishment, not because they felt safe, but because anticipation itself became exhausting. The mind cannot remain braced indefinitely for an event that never arrives. Gradually, vigilance softened, attention shifted inward. Men began to reflect not just on Breton, but on the beliefs that had defined their own actions. The contrast between what they had been told and what they were living became impossible to ignore. This was not relief, it was disorientation. Some prisoners responded by retreating further into ideological rigidity. They repeated familiar slogans. They dismissed British behavior as weakness. They insisted that kindness was merely another weapon. But repetition could no longer restore certainty. It only revealed its fragility. Others responded with silence. They observed without comment. They absorbed contradiction without resolving it. This quiet observation marked a significant psychological shift. It indicated that belief was no longer automatic. The collapse accelerated through exposure to time. British captivity was not designed to extract confessions or enforce ideological change. It simply allowed prisoners to exist under rules that applied consistently. Over months, this consistency created space for thought, not guided thought, unsupervised thought. For men accustomed to constant ideological reinforcement, this absence was profound. Libraries were available in some camps. Newspapers, censored but informative, circulated. Prisoners read about Allied advances, about bombing raids, about political debates within Britain itself. They encountered a society that argued internally, that criticized its own leadership openly, even during war. This openness unsettled them more than propaganda ever could. German ideology had portrayed unity as strength and dissent as decay, yet Britain's visible disagreements did not seem to weaken it. Institutions continued to function, civilian morale persisted, governance adapted. This contradiction chipped away at foundational assumptions. As summer approached, prisoners working outside camps encountered British civilians more frequently. Conversations remained limited and cautious, but they occurred. These interactions did not carry moral lessons. They carried mundane details: weather, crops, damage from air raids, family absences. Civilians spoke of loss without dramatization. They did not demand sympathy. They did not seek validation. They simply continued. This understated endurance challenged the caricature of British decadence and moral emptiness. It replaced it with something harder to categorize. The collapse of belief often occurred in moments that felt insignificant at the time. A guard enforcing a rule that protected prisoners from overwork. A doctor insisting on rest despite labor shortages. A supervisor correcting another guard for procedural violations. These moments revealed that power in Britain was constrained by norms, not personalities. For German prisoners raised under a system that celebrated authority unbound by restraint, this was revolutionary. The realization unfolded slowly. Britain was not treating them this way because they were German. It was treating them this way because this was how Britain treated prisoners. This distinction carried enormous psychological weight. If treatment was not dependent on ideology or race or rank, then the moral framework underpinning German propaganda began to unravel. The enemy was not selectively humane, it was procedurally consistent. This consistency forced prisoners to confront a painful possibility. The moral absolutes that had justified war, obedience, and sacrifice were incomplete at best. The collapse extended beyond perceptions of Britain. It reached inward, towards self-understanding. German prisoners began to reassess their own training. They recalled moments of arbitrary punishment, of unexplained orders, of discipline enforced through fear rather than reason. These memories, once normalized, now appeared in a different light. The comparison was unavoidable. Some prisoners experienced guilt, though they rarely articulated it. Not guilt for specific actions, but guilt for unquestioned certainty, for having accepted explanations that now seemed insufficient. Others experienced anger, not toward Britain, but toward the gap between promise and reality, toward leaders who had claimed clarity while delivering distortion. This anger was dangerous. It lacked direction. It could not be expressed openly without risk. It turned inward. The psychological collapse did not produce rebellion or gratitude. It produced ambiguity. As Allied invasion preparations intensified outside the camps, prisoners sensed that the war was entering a decisive phase. News filtered in slowly, but trends were clear. German reversals multiplied. The certainty of victory faded. Under these conditions, belief systems normally harden. Fear drives people toward absolutes. Yet for many prisoners, absolutes had already begun to dissolve. They were left without a framework that fully explained their situation. This absence was not immediately replaced. Post-war memoirs and testimonials reveal that many German prisoners struggled to articulate what captivity in Britain had done to them psychologically. They rarely described it as humane or cruel. Instead, they described it as disorienting. One former prisoner later wrote that the most difficult aspect of captivity was not deprivation, but the slow realization that he had been wrong about the world he thought he understood. This sentiment appears repeatedly in records, though phrased differently. The collapse mattered beyond the individual because belief is a collective phenomenon. German ideology relied on shared certainty. When that certainty fractured quietly, without spectacle, it weakened cohesion in ways that could not be easily repaired. British authorities did not attempt to accelerate this process overtly. They did not conduct mass re-education programs early in the war. They did not force ideological renunciation. They allowed contradiction to speak for itself. This restraint proved more effective than confrontation. By late 1944, as more prisoners entered the system and older prisoners reflected on months or years of captivity, the psychological transformation became more apparent. New arrivals still carried fear. Veterans of captivity carried skepticism. They advised newcomers not to expect brutality, not because they trusted Britain, but because experience had taught them to distrust their own expectations. This shift represented a profound inversion. The collapse of belief did not mean acceptance of British values. Many prisoners remained critical, resentful, or emotionally distant. What changed was certainty. Certainty had been replaced by doubt. Doubt is uncomfortable. It destabilizes identity. It removes simple explanations. It demands adaptation. For German prisoners, this doubt lingered long after the war ended. Post-war interviews reveal that many former POWs remembered captivity in Britain not as a time of suffering, but as a time when questions first emerged that could not be suppressed. Questions about authority, about truth, about the relationship between power and morality. These questions did not always lead to resolution, but they marked the break. Historically, this psychological collapse mattered because it demonstrated the limits of propaganda when confronted with lived experience. Ideology can shape expectation, but it cannot fully control interpretation when reality consistently contradicts it. Britain's approach to captivity was not designed as a moral demonstration. It was shaped by legal obligations, institutional habits, and practical necessity. Yet its unintended effect was profound. By refusing to behave monstrously, Britain deprived enemy ideology of its most effective reinforcement. This does not mean captivity was comfortable. It was restrictive. It was monotonous. It involved loss of freedom and uncertainty about the future. But it did not provide the narrative confirmation prisoners expected. And in that absence, belief collapsed. The collapse did not produce heroes or converts. It produced observers. Observers who learned that certainty can be manufactured and that its erosion does not require force, it requires exposure. As the war ended and prisoners were eventually repatriated, many carried this lesson with them. Some integrated it into post-war lives quietly. Others struggled against it. Some rejected it entirely. But none could fully erase the experience. The story of German POWs in Britain is not a story of kindness overcoming hatred. It is a story of expectation colliding with reality and of the psychological consequences when belief systems fail under sustained contradiction. It reveals something fundamental about human psychology, that people prepare themselves not for reality, but for the reality they have been taught to expect. And when that preparation proves useless, the resulting disorientation can be more powerful than suffering itself. In the end, Britain did not punish German prisoners in the way they expected. It did something else entirely. It allowed them to see the gap between belief and experience. And once seen, that gap could never be fully closed again.